All right, good evening. Welcome to the Minneapolis Valley Thursday night educational series. This evening we will be talking about conspiracies and misconceptions about Freemasonry. Whoa, too many, too far. All right, as we've talked about before, this is not a tiled meeting. We are recording. If you need to, please keep yourself on mute. If you do need to unmute, you can use a space bar to do that. Please send any questions for to the host via chat, and we will cover them at the end. I will also send out a survey at the end for everyone to submit before they leave. Upcoming here, the next event we have coming is May 6th and 7th for the Oriented Minnesota virtual reunion, starting with the 4th and 14th degree. And then the 18th, 20th, and 18th, 30th, and 32nd degree will be later in May as well. And now, Hans, it is all yours. You're muted, sir.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay, can I, you see the presentation?
Yes, sir. You are good to go.
Awesome. Okay, we're ready to go. Well, good evening, brother. I presume they're all brethren. What we're going to talk about today is Freemasonry, Freemason conspiracy and misinterpretation, where they come from. It's actually a two-part installment. Part one is the Leo Texas hoax, or and kind of Jason and I would talk about it. It's kind of interesting that it does happen on April 1st. So this is not a hoax, but it's about a hoax. So and maybe for those that don't know where April Fool's Day comes from, it's kind of a little bit of an interesting story because frankly, a lot of people are claiming, or a lot of nations are claiming kind of their right to April Fools, but likely dates back to France in 1582, when they switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And in the Julian calendar, the New Year's was always kind of celebrated in around the spring equinox, so in around April 1st. And when the Gregorian calendar, obviously we celebrate New Year's on January 1st. Now, while the cities kind of adopted that change from April 1st to January, a lot of the countryside, basically for years to come, still was celebrating New Year's on April 1st. So jokingly, those that were celebrating New Year's and in around the spring equinox were called the April Fools. So that's likely where this story comes from. So let's talk a little bit about the conspiracies and where do they come from. And just kind of as a precautionary note, I will be talking about religions, because not to condemn them or to applaud them, but they are just an integral part of this whole plot. So if you're sensitive to that, please tune out, or otherwise, I don't mean any harm and or insult by doing that. And speak about our religions. Here we see that the Roman Catholic Church, with their beautiful emblem here, and Freemasonry were not always very well aligned. As a matter of fact, if we kind of take a deeper look at that, that misalignment quite often manifests itself in the papal encyclicals, the papal bulls. For those that don't know what a bull is, or a papal bull is, it's basically a document that the Pope puts together as a guidance for the flock. And sometimes it's converted into Catholic law or canon law. Sometimes it's kind of a guiding document for those that subscribe to the Roman Catholic belief. Now, from the start, actually, the Catholic Church and Freemasonry were always a little bit on a battleground. So in 1717, after the formal kind of a start of Freemasonry, we gained some tractions in the mid-1700s, and several popes, starting with Clement XII, basically started making footnotes and remarks in around Freemasonry. And that actually continues all the way through the period where we see Pius IX taking a pretty strong stance and issuing several kind of condemnations of Freemasonry. And it literally peaked with Pope Leo XIII and his cardinal work, and kind of really on top of any list is his Humanum Genus. Okay. Now, to understand what was really happening, let's take a closer look. So we are finding ourselves in the late 1800s, so the late Enlightenment period. And several concepts have gained quite a bit of traction. Secularism, meaning separation of church and state, our society and kind of the thinking was really pivoted in around rationalism, civil liberties, democracy. All these concepts emerged really strong. And I think it's fair to say that Freemasons had a pretty progressive role in that one too. Now, as with many other old kind of beliefs and conceptions, also the papal power was challenged. And in response to that, Pius IX issued a kind of what he called the syllable of errors, and in there he listed 80 offenses that were against God's truth. So on top of that, there was obviously religious tolerance. In other words, if you subscribe to or accepted any religion other than Catholicism, that was an offense against God, as well as separation of state and church. Now, this was not very well perceived by the public. As a matter of fact, the Pope got really criticized as to, are you really losing touch with society? What's happening in society? Rather than maybe reflecting on this in a kind of a more contemplative way, he took a step up and issued a second response, namely the dogma of papal infallibility. And in there, it is declared that the papal opinion is supreme, or the Pope as such is beyond error in any matters of faith and morality. And to top it off, he declared that the Pope as such cannot be challenged in this. So everything that the Pope was issuing was by definition true, or there's no error in there. And obviously, he cannot be challenged, or that close the deal. Now, as to be expected, and actually, if somebody's interested, that Pastor Eternus is a really interesting document as to how the church at that point in time tried to reclaim a position that it was losing. It's multifaceted, and it's too much to get into here, but I just want to point it out. So needless to say, that was not really well received. And actually in France, it resulted in what they call the Third Revolution. And it was mainly characterized by a massive wave of anti-clericalism. Priests and nuns were imprisoned, and the Archbishop of Paris was executed. And it was not the first time that the Notre Dame was put in fire. So it was really a pretty chaotic situation. So the church found itself really in a rather big predicament. And obviously the question is, how do you reunite that chaotic flock? Obviously imposing more restriction didn't work. So they came up with a rather clever solution and says, well, let's find a common enemy. And this is definitely a sure bet. If that enemy is endorsing the separation of state and church, but also accepts all religion as equal, as Freemasonry does, and is in support of sciences, because what sciences are doing, they're explaining all these miracles away. And so as such, whatever grip the Catholic Church had on your beliefs was gradually diminished and torn apart by scientific rationalization. So if we look at this list, who comes to mind? Well, guess what? The Freemasons. And that was, by and large, the theme that evolved when Pope Leo XIII took over. And we referenced the Humanum Genus earlier on. And this was an encyclical that was almost entirely dedicated to Freemasonry. As a matter of fact, totally dedicated to Freemasonry. So let's take a look at what that encyclical basically proclaimed. It has two main or kind of what I would call themes in there. The first one is that the world is divided into two kingdoms, or cities as they are sometimes called too. The first kingdom is the kingdom of God, and are represented by, or is in essence, the true church, the Catholic Church, with earthly representation by the Pope. The second kingdom is the kingdom of Satan, and that's where the Freemasons are. Right? So that's kind of a pretty strong statement. A second main theme in that very same encyclical was that Masons practice naturalism. And there's actually quite a bit of confusion around what is naturalism. So just to clarify this, I'm going to put a couple of definitions up. And for one thing, a main theme in here is that the world consists only of natural elements and forces, and by definition and by virtue of that statement, excludes the supernatural or anything that's spiritual. Flowing out of that is a second statement, and that is that all phenomena that we are observing are covered by the laws of science, and hence all other explanations are therefore without value. Now, while we all know that the Catholic Church kind of groups Masons in this second city or second world of Satan, this second statement, namely practicing of naturalism, has a far more reaching consequence, because frankly it excludes any form of spirituality, and as we will later see, is rather condemning. So when in this presentation, when we ask ourselves, where do these conspiracy come from, we actually could stop now, because these two statements basically impregnated the fabric of the future for the next 100, 150, and probably for the next 50 to 150 years as well. Because a seed was planted in a flock of 200 million kind of Catholics. Now, when we look at the Humanum Genus, and ask ourselves, well, what does that actually mean, right? So if a Freemason is associated with Satanism, what does that actually mean, okay? You won't find the answer there. Basically, it's a broad statement where we know that Satan is something has to do with the devil and is bad, but there's nothing explicitly stated that this is, in essence, what the Pope meant with that. So we do, however, know that this took off, and all the specifics in this rather generic statement was left to the inventive minds of that time, and frankly, the inventive minds of today as well. So let's meet the guy that was by and large responsible for a lot of anti-Masonic stuff, and that is Leo Texel. Now, who was Leo Texel? His real name was Gabriel Antoine Jougand Paget. He was born in Marseille, a pretty well-established con artist, and he was educated by Jesuit monks, but they kicked him out because of recalcitrant behavior and disruptive kind of action. So the Jesuits became pretty much for the rest of his life a target that he was trying to avenge on. Unlike there is kind of a speculation as to was he a Freemason, but he actually was a Freemason, although he got expelled at the end of the apprentice degree because he was making claims to know it all, and he had a unique interpretation as to what the Masonic symbolism all meant, and quickly started practicing plagiarism around this. So what did he do? He started a career as a writer. And I'm not saying all writers have this colorful background and motivation, but certainly in his case, it helped him kind of crafting some pretty ideology-rich themes here. So his topics were, as we can expect, around secret societies, sex, and ridiculing authority. And the very first target that he was about to attack was the Catholic Church. Now, we have to remember that at that time, our anti-Catholicism was pretty high. So his stories were really, the initial stories were really pretty much in around involved in around the church. And I'm going to give you some samplings here, and that's not all inclusive, but one of which was obviously celibacy of the priesthood. And our Leo Texel took a rather unique stance here and says, well, no, don't kid yourself, because the Pope has a lot of concubines, and his sexual pleasures and sexual life is quite abundant. He also took a pretty rigorous step on the explanations in the Bible. And he said, don't kid yourself. There were no miracles. These are all things that are fabricated. And here we see how he is raising Lazarus from the death. And last but not least, his arch enemy, the Jesuits, were a pretty kind of a dedicated target, where he kind of broadly explained the sexual pleasures that these Jesuits had when women went to confession. So he got pretty heavily reprimanded, because I think at some point in time he crossed the line and was excommunicated in 1879. Think about, at an age of 26. So that's quite an accomplishment, to get the Pope's attention and to get kicked out of the church. So, and so we have to remember that while there was a lot of call it pressure against the church or uprising against the church, there was still a fairly decent amount of control they had over society. So to escape that punishment, he went actually to confession. And if you're ever interested in that story, it's a unique story. The length at which he went through confessing that he basically was at fault is just an ingenious story. But anyhow, here's the summary of his story. So the way he told the church, or the clerical staff that interviewed him, was that at the age of 14, he came in contact with Freemasonry. And of course, at that point in time, he became obsessed in the labyrinth of evil described. Now, since he now was isolated from the church, because once you're a Freemason, you obviously cannot be compatible with the Catholic Church, he naturally became involved with criminals and prostitutes. But ultimately, deep inside, and more specifically in 1881, he was overcome by shame and realized what Masonry all meant, and he left. So, and he put, at that point in time, he put himself under the guiding hands of the church. And while he was doing that, he also made sure that everybody knew that he knew everything about Freemasonry, and more specifically, how they worshipped the devil. So he also publicly kind of confirmed that he truly believed in Pope Leo XIII's papal bull, meaning that there are two cities or two worlds, God and Satan, and that obviously that Masonry belongs to the world of Satan's. And moreover, given that his talents were largely in writing, he promised the church that he would deploy these talents in the service of the church. And what better target to pick than the Freemasons? So one of his first kind of masterworks, so to speak, was the Masonic Sisters, that issued in 1886. And some of you might know, but France in the 18th century had adopted the concept that women could join the lodge, and these were called adoption lodges. So women were made Masons, and obviously the whole Masonic sister theme was an attack on these adoption or these mixed lodges. But obviously, and as everybody already could speculate, once these women were in the lodge and the doors were closed, frankly, they were just undercover institutions for sexual perversion, or there were bestial forms of carnality and prostitution. And he concluded the book with the following statement: "Mothers, lug up your daughters. Here comes the Freemasons." Now, he was clever enough to not really go in too great of a detail, but put pretty much towards the end of the book the specifics in Latin and in kind of encoded, which actually worked out pretty cleverly, because the common man could not read Latin. But since it was kind of insinuated that the dirt was in the latter part in book in Latin, fantasy of the people started living, right? So it must be true. So people started filling in the blanks. His second work was The Antichrist and the Origin of Freemasonry, which was in essence a delirious play on the Anderson Constitution. And those that are familiar with the first version of the Anderson Constitution is where Reverend Dr. Anderson claimed that Adam was the first Mason already, and the line goes on, and he basically starts in essence playing on that very same theme. But what he did do was he took several Masonic rituals and did a translation, and not a linguistic translation, but a interpretation translation. So when Masons are talking about good, they actually mean evil. If Masons are talking about charity, what they actually mean is gaining power. So he takes a whole slew of these Masonic statements and or guiding themes and converts them into a language that when you string it together, it's clearly an opposite of what the Catholic Church stood for. So it's, I mean, you have to give it to him. The work he went through and the way he connects this together was quite amazing. The next one was the Cult of the Great Architect, and I want to direct your attention to the picture to the right. I mean, those that are familiar with some of the themes here, we see the Baphomet, we see the gold of Mendes, we see the goat, we see the Masonic apron, the Ouroboros, the snake. I mean, the guy had good insights into it and knew how to spin it in a kind of an anti-Masonic way. The Masonic Assassins was really aimed at explaining why the Masons are gaining power. Because frankly, at that point in time, roughly 60% of those that were making up kind of the French government were indeed Freemasons. So his interpretation was obviously that the way Masons are gaining power is through murder. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Scottish Rite degrees, it's all a preparation leading up to the 30th degree, where 30th degrees Masons are trained in assassination. And he does not stop short of kind of expanding on that and says, well, if you don't believe it, here's an example. The murder of, that high profile murder of William Morgan is a good example how this all ties together. And if you read this, it's just unbelievable how he ties this nonsense together, but in a way that it makes sense, right? So the casual reader, not necessarily familiar with the background, eats it up, right? It's true. So now, in the meantime, the church was really applauding his work and encouraged him to continue exposing Freemasonry, because the Freemasons were the bad guys. He even got an audience with the Pope, and the Pope readily admitted that he had read everything that he had published cover to cover, right? So it's Leo or Leo Taxel, you're doing really phenomenal work. Now, shortly thereafter, Albert Pike had created the Scottish Rite rituals, and obviously that was in essence the next target for Taxel, and that's kind of where his penmanship kind of reached the peak when he issued the book called Luciferian High Order of Masonry, or a subtitle, The Palladian Order of Masons, where he stated that it was founded by Albert Pike in South Carolina, which is true, and lodges are engaged in satanic worshiping and Baphomet. And as you can see from the picture here, he is not shying away from drawing the Templars into, or making the connection between the Templars and Freemasonry. Templars were accused of worshiping Baphomet. He fills this in with obviously illustration, on Baphomet or whatever character could be found there. And Pike was obviously the supreme pontiff, but as we learned earlier in his translation, he was actually the anti-pope in the Satan's church. So, and then here again, he sprinkles it a little bit with some truth, right? That is headquartered in Charleston, And it's structured in 23 councils, but also points out it's actually globally represented. And he continues on and says, well, not unlike what we see here in France, are basically the Palladian also have female lodges where they serve as harems for the male Masons. But the primary purpose for these females is really to become the messengers between the councils. And but there's a slight difference here in that unlike in the adoption lodges, the female can also rise to power. Now, at that point in time, the story became pretty thick and somewhat unbelievable. So really, church, public, and Masons were really shocked what he was sharing in his book. And then all of a sudden, it got quiet. Dexel disappeared from the scene, and now we deal with a Dr. Bataille. He emerged as really the new correspondent on any anti-Masonic matter. And Dr. Bataille portrayed himself as a devout Catholic, and he was a doctor on a ship, medical doctor, and a man of science who had traveled the world. And in his encounters over the world, he was so outraged over what Masonry was doing that he needed to share his outrage with the rest of the world, because this global satanic cult was just taking over the world. So what happened is he now published a book that was the bestseller of the time. It was called The Devil of the 19th Century. And it was a serialized expose on Luciferian Masonry. And if you look at the picture, I mean, it's quite obvious what the main themes are. Right? So you have magnetism, occult, the Kabbalah, the precursor to the Antichrist. And I mean, the themes were already readily kind of interpretable at the front cover. But if you read it, and it's a 960, I think it's about 960 pages. But if you read it, it also has a flavor of authenticity. Because the way Dr. Bataille portrays himself is as a man of science, right? So he says, well, don't believe these superstitions, walking under a ladder, if a black cat cross your road is all nonsense. You have to stick with the facts and be driven by the facts. And obviously the fact that he also described the glamour of faraway islands or faraway lands that he had visited added all to a taste of believability. And frankly, the book was a bestseller. I mean, it translated in multiple languages. It got our high publication number. And so the theme in his book is the following. So his first encounter was in India, where I think it was in Ceylon, where he landed and met a friend that was previously pretty rich, well off, and was in total disarray. And inquiring as to what had happened to him, he said that the Masons have contributed to my ruin. I was trying to discover what they were doing, and really they sabotaged me. And so Bataille felt really compassionate with the guy and says, well, give me the passwords. I'm going to investigate here. So he disguised as a Mason, and lo and behold, once he was in, he quickly realized what was going to happen. That frankly, these Oriental practices like snake charming and fire walking and monkey marriages had nothing to do with these Oriental practices. They were actually Satanisms that was controlled by and instigated by the English Freemasons. But the English Freemasons were not necessarily fully to blame, because they were all under control of the new Reformed Palladian Rite. And the main goal of the Palladian Rite was to murder the Catholic missionaries that were in India. So that was basically the theme. And again, the pictures in the book are pretty good, because we see on here, we see a bunch of Masons witnessing a monkey wedding and just making sure that everything was happening as per script. And that was also the reason that one of the Palladian representative of the headquarters was in India. And he met with Dr. Bataille, and Bataille apparently portrayed himself as a sincere Mason, and he was invited to Charleston to visit the headquarters. So Dr. Bataille, enticed and excited about it, obviously took that opportunity. And he met in Charleston. where he in person was greeted by Dr. Pike, Albert Pike and Dr. Mackey. And that is also where he discovered that this was not just a US phenomenon, this was a phenomenal thing. And the way he found out is when Dr. Mackey was showing him the Arcula Mystica, which was a mystical box. And this box was basically a frog, had an earpiece, a mouthpiece, and 7 gold statues. And when Albert Pike or Dr. Mackey wanted to communicate with any of the satellite headquarters in the world, like in Rome and Berlin and Washington, Calcutta, all he had to do was tip that the corresponding gold figure statue over, and then the frog on the other side of the world would start billowing smoke and fire, and then obviously the communication was being established. And that by itself was clearly evidence that there are diabolic supernatural forces are at work that are satanic in nature. So, but as he was gaining the confidence of our Dr. Albert Pike and Dr. Mackey, he was also shown the St. Peter's of Satanism. And frankly, there was a corner of our King and Wentworth, where the Scottish Rite was housed, which was kind of an innocent looking building. But in reality, it was really the entrance to an elaborate and underground labyrinth where there were great halls and initiation rooms and gathering centers. And so Dr. Bataille gives us a very detailed layout as to what is happening, where each of the main chapters had their representation in terms of prep rooms and going through these secret ceremonies. In the center, we have a labyrinth with the Sanctum Sanctorum of evil in the center. So the candidate had to struggle his way through the labyrinth to get there. And then over here in this triangular thing, that was the domain where Albert Pike conducted his mischievous behavior or made his plan for the thing. And while he was there, he was also eyewitness to very elaborate rituals. And just to mention a few, he witnessed firsthand how Masons were elevating objects. He also witnessed the reenactment of Templar rituals. He saw firsthand bodily transformations that were kind of satanically driven. He saw demons being summoned. But what was most shocking was really when he noticed that Albert Pike, the Luciferian Pope, every Friday at 3 p.m. met with Satan in person to be instructed on the specifics of the satanic rituals that the order had to practice. Okay, so this was really, but the keen observer he also realized there was a crisis going on. And unlike what we saw in the French adoption lodges, actually the female Palladians could rise to great power. So while they were at first kind of intercouncil secret messengers for their leaders, and now they had risen to tremendous power. And just to single out two, the first one, Sophia Sappho, who he learned was going to be the great grandmother of the Antichrist in the 21st century. So brothers, brace yourself. That might already have happened or might still happening. And the other one was Diana Vaughan, who claimed to be a descendant of the likewise named medieval mystic and alchemist Vaughan. Now, Albert Pike had died in 1891, and so obviously the battle of succession started. And unlike what we see today, this is not a male business. This was basically a female business. So the two contenders were basically striving to kind of get that or to grab that leadership. And ultimately, Sophia Sappho triumphed over Diane Vaughan. And understandably, I mean, as the great grandmother of the Antichrist, you have a notch ahead of a medieval mystic, right? So, but anyhow, so Diane, knowing how powerful and how evil-minded Sophia was, fled and abandoned the satanic cult. And once away, she basically really became ashamed of what she had partaken in and was seeking forgiveness. And so she converted to Catholicism. And in that process, he also was encouraged to write her memoirs and really reveal what was happening in her, or during that period that she was in the Palladian order. Now, knowing the immense network of the Freemasons, she did not know where to go except obviously to turn to Taxil, because Taxil was the anti-Masonic expert in the whole Catholic realm. And there she asked for his protection and obviously shared the content of her memoirs. Now, you have to appreciate the fact that media, newspapers, pamphlets at that point in time, they were saturated with this bullshit, right? So everybody was reading this, and obviously the public as well as the church was really intrigued by that mystery of Diane. So everyone wanted to know what are the specifics here. So the first exposure of Diane was in September 1896, where the church sponsored the first international anti-Masonic Congress in Trent. Okay, and not unexpectedly, the central topic was obviously Diana von Gahn, right? And would her memoirs really validate all that satanic behavior that these Masons are kind of practicing, right? And this was a very well attended kind of a conference. Thousands attended, actually 86 bishops were represented. Now, at that point in time, there were also quite a bit of people that says this is all nonsense, right? And actually, for instance, the Archbishop of South Carolina personally traveled to that conference and says, you know, guys, this is not all that bad. These Masons, I know them. I have talked to them and I visit their, their temple. It's granted, it doesn't follow the call it the Catholic scheme, but these are not really bad guys. But the hype was there. So everybody wanted to really talk to our Diane, or more specifically, learn what was in our memoirs, because that was going to, what it was deemed to be the validating evidence by which Masons would be incriminated. So at that point in time, Taxil took the stage and says, well, you know what, guys, I, as the Masonic expert, I do know how evil these guys are. And if she ever would publish that story, her life is in danger. So I cannot really support this. Now, needless to say, that was pretty disappointing for the crowd there. But in the meantime, however, the controversy grew because one of the things was that our famous Dr. Bataille, who wrote the 19th Century Devil, was identified as actually Dr. Charles Hacks. And when interviewed, he basically admitted, hey, you know what, everything I wrote was fraud. It was all nonsense, right? So Taxil was really realizing that this was kind of a hoax that was played. Taxil was still pressured to reveal Diana, and obviously the memoirs. So obviously this first attempt, he could dodge the bullet, but the second one, the pressure was on. He knew he had to do something. So in April of 1897, he rented the most prestigious building in Paris, the Société Géographique on Boulevard de Saint-Germain in Paris. And it's really a phenomenal building. And he invited pretty much everybody that had any name, rank, or status, right? Church, politicians, newspapers, Freemasons obviously were invited. And to make it even more interesting, he offered some raffle prizes, a typewriter, and a little nugget here on the side. The one who won the typewriter was actually the great grandfather of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK. So it's kind of a little of a side. So everything was prepped, everything was basically staged, and obviously that auditorium was just sparkling with excitement, right? So everybody's waiting for Taxil now to show up, and lo and behold, he stepped up, and with a shriek voice, he basically announced, guys, there was never a Diane von Gahn. All stories are fabricated, and went on a long streak really to ridicule the church and the public for taking such nonsense stories really serious. And as a matter of fact, to sum it up, The joke was on them, right? So what happened? Obviously, silence at first. I mean, you could hear a needle drop in that room. Because why? I mean, 12 years of high profile publicity ended just with this blunt statement. I mean, nobody could believe it. So, and then as kind of the message started sinking in, many of the churchmen were really confused. They were baffled. Some wept, some walked, right? But what was most surprising was that despite the fact that he just had disclosed that he had taken them for a run for almost 12 years, the crowd still demanded to see Diane. Where is Diane? We want to see Diane, right? So, and then in his response was, I am Diane, reiterating basically that he was the author of everything behind that. So then anger turned into violence, and Taxel really barely escaped the mob because they literally started storming the podium and kind of wanted to shred him into parts. So police got him out there and saved. But what was most astonishing was really that story died within weeks. And despite the fact that he had incriminated everybody that had any authority or any representation in public, nobody prosecuted him. And the reason was really fear of additional publicity and humiliation. Because, I mean, you could pursue your cause, but you know damn well that the media would be jumping on that. And all that would come out of it was really an endorsement of your stupidity of believing this story for nearly 12 years, right? So Taxel retired as a really wealthy con man and died on a sizable estate in 1907. So now what's the aftermath of Taxel? Well, this hoax really has fueled the specifics in anti-Masonic rhetoric for more than 100 years. Because remember, the Humanum Genum only says that Masons are associated with Satan, nothing specific. But this clown really, in a very colorful way, painted in exactly what that means, how Masons are practicing Satanism, or how they kind of infiltrate society, etc. And even the churches. I mean, Benedict the 16th here in 1983, so nearly 100 years after the event, says that membership in Freemasonry is forbidden. Joining is a grave sin, and if you do join, you can't receive the Holy Communion. Okay. Francis in 2013 has some dark language about the mysterious Masonic lobby conspiring against the church. And it's not just the Catholics, because the evangelical Protestants in 1992 and 93 really had a huge anti-Masonic uproar in the South, where they reiterated that Masons are worshiping Baphomet, just like Taxel has stated. And our rhetoric emerged and was really presented in a way that this is what I believe, that Pike remains the anti-pope. And everybody who belongs to the Scottish Rite belongs in that chapter of these anti-pope, or in that group of the anti-pope. So looking at this and reflecting, we have to ask ourselves, what's the takeaway? Okay, what is this story telling us? Well, for one thing, if we see an institution in trouble and forcefully trying to regain that power, that's an indication. And we also see that if they don't have an enemy that can be identified, they invent an enemy. And the sole purpose of that is really direct the attention away from your own problems, because the Catholic Church at that point in time was sticking to a paradigm and a way of thinking of morals and ethics that were outdated, right? So if you stick to that and don't admit to it, well, project that kind of a chaos on the outside world, and then in essence tell them it's their fault, right? And then those that are belonging to that institution you're applauded when you condemn that enemy, but if you align yourself with the enemy, you're going to be punished. Generally, as we saw in this example, that's done in rather generic terms. So the media is clearly, in this case, it was Leo Taxel, but in our day and age, it's the media in various forms that fills in really the specifics in about this enemy. right? And it's very effective if it's mixed with facts and a little bit fictions and the like. And it works, gents, it works. Because as a human species, we have an inborn intolerance to differences, right? We unite easily in the presence of an enemy. And audiences do pass on judgment, even when they're blinded from reality. So the question is, how do we kind of avoid this? Well, there are actually 4 little checkpoints, right? If you associate it with an institution that is waning in power, okay, put a check mark there. If you are asked to align or with that institution and align against that enemy, even if that means that friends and family are divided, put a check here. If you see the media kind of reporting on this, and several sources of the media are reporting contradictory stories, put a check there. And if you see the world around you kind of responding with excitement and passing on judgment, put a check there. And if you have all 4 checks placed, there's a pretty high probability that your thoughts, your wallet, or both are target of getting hijacked. So, gentlemen, that's the conclusion. Thanks for attending. I know it took a little bit longer. Certainly open for questions and discussion. Also want to put in a shameless plug for part 2, and that is kind of how Freemasons and the Jews plan to take over the world. It's a central theme in around the protocols of the Elders of Zion. With that, I'm going to give it over to Jason.
Thank you, brother, for the presentation. Brother Justin, I know you had a question in the chat. If you want to go ahead and ask that. Try unmuting first, though, please. Okay. What is a monkey marriage? 2 monkeys marry? He asks.
So I don't know the specifics of this, but there's apparently a ritual where some kind of shaman or priest is marrying monkeys. I don't know the background of that, but it seems to be a Oriental practice, but I don't know the specific of it.
So Justin, does that answer your question now that you can unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. That helps quite a bit when I can unmute myself.
All right, brethren, any other questions? Any more questions?
How did Texel die rich? How did he make his money other than selling his pamphlets and his stuff? Was the church paying him?
No, actually, so during his success story where he was attacking the church, his books sold like hot cookies. And obviously, he was the author under the pseudonym Bataille. So that book was internationally distributed. Actually, as a matter of fact, you can download it. It's if anybody's interested, I can send you the link. It's available on not Gutenberg. I can't remember where I found it. But anyhow, he kept continuing publishing books all the way up to his death, or his publisher did. And there was a steady stream of income. There was a lot of money coming in. So there's as today, there was a tremendous hunger for nonsense and rumors.
Thank you.
So that hasn't changed much. Any other questions, brethren? All right, while you guys are thinking, give me 1 second, and we will get the survey posted into the chat. Any other questions? Well, Brother Hans, thank you for that presentation. It was well done. Very much appreciated. And we will be communicating when part 2 is available, I guess. Mm-hmm. So it's not currently on the calendar. As you may have noticed, we didn't talk about what's coming up next. Currently, we don't have anything on our on our schedule at this moment. Please keep an eye on the webinar site on the Minneapolis Valley page. If there are new ones coming up, we'll post them up there. We'll also get them up on Facebook and stuff like that when there's new sessions available. Last call for questions. Hearing none, I will call it an evening. Thank you again, Hans, for your presentation.